Abigail Whittaker set her wedding ring on the kitchen table at midnight. Not with anger, not with tears, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had finally heard the truth she had spent 7 years refusing to believe. If you've ever loved someone who treated your devotion like furniture, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel. Follow Abigail's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1814 had been brutal in Virginia. Not the heat, though the heat was something fierce, the kind that pressed down on the chest like a hand that wouldn't lift. What was brutal was the silence inside the Whittaker estate. The long corridors, the dining table set for two eaten alone, the sound of Nathaniel's boots on the floorboards above her head moving away. Always moving away. Abigail had learned to measure her husband's moods by sound, the weight of his step when he came home from Silas Mercer's, the particular way he cleared his throat before he said something cruel, dressed up as something reasonable. 7 years of marriage had made her fluent in a language she had never wanted to learn. She had gone to bed early that night, the way she did most nights when Nathaniel had company. She told herself she was tired. She was always telling herself that. But sleep didn't come. It never came on nights when the house felt wrong. She lay still for a long time, listening to the low rumble of men's voices beneath the floorboards. Nathaniel and Thomas Hale and Silas Mercer, his two closest companions, the men he trusted more than he had ever trusted her. They met like that once or twice a month, usually with bourbon and business, and the kind of laughter that had nothing to do with joy. Abigail told herself to close her eyes. Instead, she sat up. She pulled her robe around her shoulders and lifted the candle from the nightstand. She didn't know what she was looking for. She told herself later that she had simply been thirsty. That she'd only meant to go down for water. That what happened next was not something she had sought out. But the truth was, some part of her had always known. She padded barefoot down the main staircase, one hand trailing the banister, the candle flame bending with each step. The voices grew louder as she descended, separating themselves from one another. Silas's deep, rolling drawl. Thomas's quick, bright laugh. And Nathaniel's voice, steady and amused, the way it always was when he was performing for an audience he respected. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom when she heard her name. "Abigail still sets a place for me at breakfast," Nathaniel was saying. "Every single morning. Even when I've been gone 3 days." Laughter. Easy, comfortable laughter. "That woman," Thomas said. "She looks at me like I hung the moon," Nathaniel continued. 7 years, and she still watches the door when I'm late. "Damnedest thing I've ever seen." Silas said something she didn't catch. Then Nathaniel, again clearer now, almost fond in the way a man is fond of a dog that does exactly what it's been trained to do. It's convenient is what it is. A man needs a certain kind of woman at home. The kind who doesn't ask too many questions, keeps the house right, keeps the servants in line, keeps her mouth shut at supper when there's company. Abigail does all of that, perfectly. He paused, and she heard the clink of a glass. She's easy to manage, always has been." "You don't feel bad about it?" Thomas asked, though he didn't sound like he thought Nathaniel should. "Feel bad about what? About the way she—" Thomas lowered his voice, but not enough. "The woman genuinely loves you, Nathaniel." "I know she does." Another pause. Another easy, unbothered exhale. "That's what makes it so simple." More laughter. Abigail stood perfectly still at the bottom of the stairs. The candle flame didn't waver. Her hand on the banister didn't shake. She had spent years training herself not to shake, not in front of Nathaniel, not in front of his friends, not in front of the servants who watched everything and said nothing. She had built that stillness like a wall, and now it held. Inside the wall something was breaking. But that was private. That had always been private. She turned and walked back up the stairs. 1 step, 2, 3. She counted them the way she had counted a great many things in this house: dinner guests, laundered linens, the number of times Nathaniel had kissed her forehead in the last calendar year 4. She counted because counting kept the mind busy and the throat from closing. Back in the bedroom, she set the candle on the dresser and stood looking at herself in the mirror. She was 27 years old. She had come to this house at 20, bright-eyed and genuinely happy, convinced that the man she married was more complicated than people gave him credit for. She had spent 7 years being patient, understanding, accommodating. She had told herself he showed love differently, that he was busy, that men of his station had pressures she didn't fully understand. She had told herself a great many things. Abigail reached up and unpinned her hair. She watched it fall around her shoulders in the candlelight, the gesture automatic, something she did every night. Then she reached for the wedding ring on her left hand. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it on the dresser. She didn't throw it, didn't drop it. She set it down carefully, the way she set down fine china. The way she set down everything in this house gently, so nothing broke, so no one was disturbed. Even now, at the end of everything, she was careful. She turned from the mirror and opened the wardrobe. She pulled out the plain canvas bag she had brought with her when she came to this house as a bride, the one she had never unpacked entirely, because there had always been something in her that understood this place was not quite home. She shook it out and set it on the bed. She was methodical about it. A second dress, dark blue wool for traveling. A change of undergarments. Her mother's Bible, small and water-stained, which she kept in the back of the wardrobe behind things Nathaniel would never look through. A leather purse containing $11.40 money she had set aside over the course of 2 years, a coin here and there from household accounts, never enough to be noticed. A bar of soap. A comb. She did not take the pearl brooch Nathaniel had given her on their first anniversary. She did not take the silk shawl from their trip to Charleston. She took only what had been hers before him. By 1 in the morning, the voices downstairs had quieted. She heard Thomas and Silas leave the particular slam of the front door horses on the road. She heard Nathaniel in the study, the scrape of a chair, the sound of a bottle set on wood. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. She heard him climb the stairs. She heard him pass the bedroom door without stopping. The guest room at the end of the hall. The click of a latch. Silence. It had been 6 weeks since Nathaniel had slept in their room. She had not asked why. She had learned early in the marriage that asking Nathaniel certain questions produced a particular kind of cold, deliberate response. A response designed not to answer, but to remind her of her place. So she had stopped asking. She had simply moved her pillow to the center of the bed and told herself that some men slept apart when they were tired. She waited another half hour. Then she stood, picked up her bag, and walked out of the room. She went to the kitchen first. She moved without the candle. Now she knew this house in the dark, knew every creak in every board, every low beam in every doorway. She packed bread wrapped in cloth, a wedge of hard cheese, 2 apples from the bowl on the sideboard. She filled a small flask from the water pitcher. She wrote nothing. She had thought briefly about leaving a letter. Something dignified. Something that said what she needed to say. But then, she thought of Nathaniel reading it aloud to Thomas and Silas reading it with that easy, unbothered voice, letting them laugh, and she folded that thought away. Her words were not for him. He had already told her what her words were worth to him. She left through the kitchen door at the back of the house. The summer night was still warm, thick with the smell of grass and red clay. The woods behind the estate were dark and full of sound crickets, a whippoorwill, somewhere distant, the creak of old trees. Abigail had walked those woods many times in daylight. She had walked them with a basket and an easy heart in the years when she still believed that Nathaniel might one day look at her the way she had once looked at him. She walked into them now with 1 bag over her shoulder and $11.40 and no plan beyond the road that ran north through the Virginia countryside toward the frontier settlements. She did not look back at the house. She thought she would feel something when she crossed the tree line. Grief maybe, or fear, or the particular hollow feeling she sometimes got in church when the choir sang something too beautiful. But what she felt stepping out from under the shadow of the Whitaker estate and into the open road beyond the tree line was something quieter than any of those. She felt like a window that had been closed for 7 years finally opened. The road was pale in the darkness, running north through the trees. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when she heard a horse. She stepped sideways off the road without thinking, instinct, the kind of instinct a woman builds when she lives for long enough in a world that does not always treat her well. She stood in the undergrowth and listened. One horse, moving slow, unhurried. A man's voice, low and quiet, talking to the animal, the way some men did, not commanding, just talking. Easy now. Easy. The horse and rider came around the bend at a walk. The rider was a broad-shouldered man, hatted, carrying a lantern low at his side. He sat easy in the saddle the way frontiermen did, like the horse was an extension of him, not something he was trying to control. He did not appear to be in a hurry. He also very clearly had seen her. He slowed the horse to a stop. He did not call out. He simply waited, the lantern steady in his hand, and let her decide. After a moment, Abigail stepped back onto the road. "I'm not in any trouble," she said, which was only partially true. The man looked at her for a moment, not the way Nathaniel's friends looked at women, running their eyes up and down like they were calculating value. He looked at her the way a man looks when he is actually paying attention. "No, ma'am," he said. "I can see that." She wasn't sure what exactly he saw. She was aware of how she appeared, a woman alone on a road before dawn, plain bag over one shoulder, wedding ring notably absent from her left hand. She kept her chin up anyway. "I'm traveling north," she said. "Toward the settlement past Dunmore's Crossing. I know the road." "It's a good road," he said. "Long, though. 15 miles or better, depending on which crossing you take." "I know." He looked at her another moment. Then he reached up and touched the brim of his hat. "Elias Boone," he said, "out of Dunmore's settlement. I've been down to Charlottesville on survey business. Heading back now." "Abigail," she said. She did not give her married name. "Traveling north." "Yes, ma'am, you said that." His voice had no judgment in it. "There's water in my canteen if you'd like it. And the road splits about a mile ahead. You'll want the eastern fork, not the western. Western one floods when it rains, and it rained 2 days ago." Abigail looked at him. She had spent 7 years learning to read men, the particular architecture of their courtesy, what it concealed, what it cost. This man's courtesy appeared to cost him nothing and conceal nothing. It was simply the way he spoke. "Thank you," she said carefully, "for the information." "Yes, ma'am." He gathered the reins. "If you want to walk alongside, I'm in no hurry, but I won't press the offer if you'd rather not." She considered that. She considered the 15 miles of dark road and the eastern fork she might have missed, and the fact that she had not eaten since supper and was already beginning to feel it. "I'll walk," she said, "if that's agreeable." "More than," he said, and clicked his tongue to the horse. They moved north through the warm summer darkness, the horse at a quiet walk, Abigail alongside. Elias Boone did not ask her questions. He did not fill the silence with reassurances or observations about the night or the road or her circumstances. He rode and she walked, and the lantern swung gently between them, and the whippoorwill sang somewhere in the trees. She had expected questions. She had prepared herself for them. Men in her experience could not resist the opportunity of a woman in a vulnerable position. It made them feel important to offer advice, solutions, corrections of her logic. Nathaniel had been particularly skilled at it. He had an answer for everything she thought and felt and wanted, and his answers always circled back to the same point, that she was better off trusting his judgment than her own. Elias Boone said nothing for a solid half-mile. Then, "Your hem's torn on the right side. There's a briar patch about a quarter-mile back. Easy to catch on." Abigail glanced down. He was right, a long tear along the hem of her walking skirt, the fabric caught and dragged. She must have walked through without feeling it. "Thank you," she said. "It'll hold fine," he said. "Just letting you know." Another half-mile of quiet. "You've been to Dunmore's Crossing before?" he asked. "Once, 3 years ago. Nathaniel." She stopped, reorganized. I came through on my way to my cousin's house, to the east. I remember the settlement was larger than I'd expected. It's grown, he said. We've got a grist mill now, schoolhouse in progress. My aunt runs a... He paused in a way that she recognized as a man deciding how much to say. She's useful to people, women particularly. She's got knowledge that's hard to come by out here. Abigail looked up at him. What kind of knowledge? Medicine mostly. Land reading, record keeping. He tilted his head slightly. She knew women back before certain things got, he seemed to choose the word, erased. She remembers what women were capable of before they were told to stop being capable of it. Abigail was quiet for a moment. That's an interesting way to put it, she said. It's the true way, he said simply. Reckon the true way usually is interesting if you've been told something else long enough. She looked at him again, this quiet man on his quiet horse in the warm Virginia dark, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not love, nothing like that. Nothing so simple. Something more fundamental than that. The feeling of being spoken to as though her intelligence was a given. As though her ability to understand the world around her was not something that needed to be managed or contained. It was such a small thing. It was an enormous thing. Dawn found them at the edge of Dunmore Settlement, a cluster of wood-frame buildings, a broad cleared yard. Smoke beginning to rise from morning fires. The settlement smelled of sawdust and summer grass, and something baking bread or cornmeal. The smell of people waking up and beginning their day. Elias Boone brought his horse to a stop at the outer edge of the yard. My aunt's house is the second one there, the one with the blue shutters. She'll be up already. She's always up. He paused. She won't ask you questions you don't want to answer. Abigail stood looking at the blue-shuttered house. She thought of the Whitaker estate, the high white columns, the polished floors, the dining room with the walnut table that seated 16. She thought of the bedroom she had just walked out of, the dresser, where her wedding ring still sat, the kitchen door she had closed carefully behind her so as not to wake the servants. She thought of Nathaniel's voice, unbothered and amused. That's what makes it so simple. Thank you, she said. For the road, for the water, for not... She stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. For not being what she had expected. For not asking. For not making her small. Elias Boone touched the brim of his hat. You're welcome, ma'am. For whatever it is. He rode toward the barn at the far end of the settlement. Abigail watched him go for a moment. Then she squared her shoulders, lifted her bag, and walked toward the blue shutters. Inside the Whitaker estate 15 miles south, a wedding ring sat on a mahogany dresser in an empty room. Nathaniel Whitaker slept soundly down the hall undisturbed, certain as he had always been certain that everything in his house was exactly where he had left it. He would not discover his error until morning. By then Abigail was already somewhere he could not reach. Not because she was hiding. Because she had finally, after 7 years of making herself smaller and quieter and less, decided to take up the full amount of space she had always deserved. And the woman who knocked on Martha Boone's blue-shuttered door at sunrise was not Mrs. Nathaniel Whitaker, convenient and predictable and easy to manage. She was just Abigail. And Abigail, it turned out, was more than enough. Martha Boone opened the door before Abigail knocked. That was the first thing that unsettled her. The door swinging inward, just as her knuckles were rising, and a woman standing in the frame who looked at her not with surprise, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had been expecting company, just not sure of the hour. Martha Boone was perhaps 60, perhaps older. She had Elias's broad shoulders and his stillness, that quality of taking up space without demanding anything from it. Her hair was silver and pulled back without ceremony. Her eyes were the color of creek water, in shade gray and green and observant. You look like you've been walking since midnight, Martha said. Since about 1:30, Abigail answered. Martha stepped aside. Come in then. Coffee's on. Abigail crossed the threshold. The house was small and orderly, in the way that spoke not of poverty, but of intention. Every object in a chosen place, every surface serving a purpose. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. Shelves of labeled jars lined the far wall. A writing desk sat near the window, with a ledger open on it. Figures in neat columns that Abigail found herself reading automatically before she remembered she was a guest and looked away. She sat at the kitchen table. Martha set a cup in front of her and sat across. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Martha said, "You don't have to tell me anything." "I know," Abigail said. "Your nephew said the same." "Elias tends to say the right things," Martha said. "He learned it from watching what happens when people say the wrong ones." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I'll only ask one thing. Are you safe right now this morning? Are you safe?" Abigail considered the question the way she had not allowed herself to consider it all night while she was moving, while motion had been the only medicine she had. She turned it over carefully. "Yes," she said finally. "No one's coming after me. Not yet." She paused. "Maybe not at all. I'm not sure he'll bother." The words came out flatter than she intended. Martha heard what was underneath them anyway. "That's sometimes worse," Martha said quietly. "When you're not even worth the chase." Abigail's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together and nodded once. "Eat something," Martha said, and stood to slice bread. "Then sleep. Everything else can wait." She slept through this morning and most of the afternoon in the small back room Martha kept. For as Martha put it, without further explanation, women who need a moment to stop moving. The room had a narrow bed and a window that faced the settlement yard, and through it, Abigail could hear the sounds of a working community going about its day. A hammer, children's voices, a woman calling out to someone across the yard. Ordinary sounds. She had not heard ordinary sounds in a very long time. The Whitaker estate had its own sounds, but none of them had ever felt ordinary. They had always felt like performance. When she woke, the light was angling toward late afternoon, and she sat on the edge of the bed and took stock of herself, the way she might take stock of an unfamiliar house room by room, carefully noting what was damaged and what still held. She was 27 years old. She had $11.40. She had no legal protection, no property in her own name, no formal arrangement with anyone in this settlement. Under the laws of Virginia in the summer of 1814, she was still Nathaniel Whitaker's wife, which meant she was in most legal and practical senses still Nathaniel Whitaker's property. That thought had a weight to it that no amount of sleep could lift. She stood anyway. Martha was in the front room when Abigail came out sitting at her writing desk with the ledger open and a pen in hand. She did not look up immediately, which Abigail appreciated. It meant she did not have to arrange her face into anything before she was ready. "Sit down," Martha said without turning. "I want to show you something." Abigail sat in the chair beside the desk. Martha turned the ledger so she could see it. It was not a household ledger. The columns were names, women's names, dates, locations, and beside each one a brief notation. Arrived March. Left April with work arranged at. Arrived June. Child with her. Placed with family north of. On and on, page after page, going back years. Abigail looked up. "You do this," she said. "You help women, not just with medicine." "Medicine is what I tell the men," Martha said simply. "Men understand medicine. They're comfortable with women who heal things. Makes sense to them cleaning up messes is woman's work, whether the mess is a wound or a broken life." She took the ledger back. "What I actually do is keep records, track resources, know which farms need workers and which women need farms, know which lawyers owe me favors and which judges remember that I delivered their children." She paused. "Information is the only property a woman in this country can own outright." Abigail stared at her. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Since I was about your age," Martha said. "Since I understood that waiting for the law to catch up to justice was a choice only women with nowhere to be could afford to make." She looked at Abigail directly. "What can you do? Not what you've been allowed to do. What can you actually do?" The question landed differently than Abigail expected. She had been asked what she could do before by Nathaniel's mother during the first year of marriage by the estate's head housekeeper when she arrived by the women at church who wanted to know her domestic capabilities. Those questions had all been the same question dressed up differently. What will you contribute to this household? What is your value to this man? Martha was asking something else entirely. Abigail took a breath. I can manage accounts. I learned from my father he ran a trading business outside of Charlottesville, and he taught me his record system from the time I was 12. I can read a ledger track inventory, identify where money is going wrong. She paused. I can read and write well. I know plants not medicine, but which ones grow when and where, which ones are useful for what. I was managing all of the Whitaker estate's household accounts. Nathaniel thought the housekeeper did it. She was following my instructions. Martha tilted her head. Did he know that? He never asked. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your mother's family. The Carver name out of the lower Shenandoah Valley. Am I thinking right? Abigail went very still. How did you know my mother's name? Martha stood, went to a different shelf, and pulled down a smaller book. Older, the spine worn soft with handling. She set it on the table and opened it to a page near the middle. Abigail looked at the names on the page. Eleanor Carver, daughter of Ruth Carver, healer and land recorder. Property of the Carver family. 42 acres Upper Meadow River access. Recorded in trust, 1791. Status unclaimed, following Eleanor Carver's marriage to James Ellsworth, 1793. Abigail's mother had died when Abigail was 11. She had died quietly, the way she had lived, without complaint, without claim, without ever once telling Abigail that there had been land and a name and a history that marriage had simply erased. My mother had property, Abigail said. The words came out strange in her mouth, like a sentence in a language she was reading for the first time. Her family did, Martha said carefully. What happened to it when she married your father is a legal question. What happened to your right to it when you married Nathaniel is a different question. Both of them have answers. She paused. I'm not saying it would be simple. I'm saying it isn't nothing. Abigail pressed her hand flat on the page, on her grandmother's name, on the words 42 acres river access, as if she could feel the land through the paper. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you walked 15 miles in the dark to get here, Martha said. Because you came without asking anyone's permission, which means you already know somewhere in yourself that you have the right to make decisions without a man's signature on them. And because... Martha paused, closed the book gently. Your grandmother was a woman who helped a great many people in this valley before the world decided her name didn't matter anymore. I knew her. I was young and she was old, but I knew her. And I've been waiting a good while to see if anyone was going to come along and remember her. Chinday. 3 days passed. Abigail helped in Martha's kitchen, helped with the small patients who came to the door, a child with a fever, an old farmer with a wrapped wrist, a young woman whose reasons for coming were not quite medical, and who Martha handled with the same matter-of-fact kindness she handled everything. Abigail watched how Martha listened, how she asked questions, how she gave information in the form of options rather than instructions. She watched, and she filed it away, the way she had always filed things, quietly and carefully, in the part of her mind Nathaniel had never known existed. On the 4th morning, a rider came from the south. Abigail was in the yard when she heard the horse. She looked up and her stomach dropped before her brain had fully processed what she was seeing. Not Nathaniel. She could see that from the build and the horse, but someone who rode like a man on an errand, purposeful and quick, someone who had been sent. It was a boy, actually, no more than 16, thin and freckled, riding a chestnut mare that Abigail recognized with a cold jolt as one of the Whitaker estate horses. He pulled up in the yard and looked around. His eyes landed on Abigail. I'm looking for a woman called Abigail, he said. Mrs. Whitaker. Every person in the yard. 2 men near the grist mill, a woman hanging washing, stopped what they were doing. Abigail stood very still. Who sent you? She said. Mr. Whitaker, ma'am. The boy reached into his coat and produced a folded letter. He says it's urgent. He says—" The boy glanced down clearly, reciting something he'd been told to say. "He says you don't understand what you've done, and he needs to speak with you before this goes any further." Before this goes any further. Nathaniel's language. Careful, measured, designed to make her feel that whatever was happening was her doing and her problem to fix. Abigail looked at the letter. She did not take it. "Tell Mr. Whitaker," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her, "that I understand perfectly what I've done. I've taken nothing that belongs to him. I've caused no damage to his property or his reputation." She paused. "Tell him also that if he wishes to correspond with me on any matter, he is welcome to do so through—" She glanced at Martha, who had appeared in the doorway behind her, "through legal channels." The boy blinked. He was clearly not prepared for this response. He had probably expected tears or a frightened rush for the letter or immediate agreement to come back. "Ma'am," he tried, "Mr. Whitaker he's very—" "I heard you the first time," Abigail said gently. "You've done your job. You can tell him you delivered the message." She turned and walked back toward the house. She heard the boy sit there for a moment, uncertain. Then the sound of the horse turning. Then hoofbeats south. Martha held the door open. "That was well done," she said. "My hands are shaking," Abigail said. "They can shake all they want," Martha said, "long as your voice doesn't." Elias Boone came back from a 2-day survey 3 afternoons later. He appeared in the yard in the easy way. He did everything dismounting without announcement, leading the horse toward the water trough. Looking up when Abigail came out of the blue-shuttered house, and registering no particular surprise at seeing her still there. "Miss Abigail," he said. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Your aunt is remarkable." "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "She'd be the first to tell you." He tied off the horse and walked toward the house. Abigail fell into step beside him, without quite deciding to. "A rider came from the Whitaker estate," she said. "3 days ago." Elias glanced at her. "I heard." "You heard quickly." "Small settlement," he said. "News moves." She looked at him sideways. "What did you hear? I heard you sent him back without taking the letter." Elias paused at the door. "I also heard you said legal channels, which means you're thinking ahead of the problem, not just away from it." "I'm trying to," she said. "That's the harder thing," he said. "Running is easy. Planning is what takes courage." He pushed the door open and went inside. Abigail stood on the step for a moment, turning that over. Running is easy. Planning is what takes courage. She had spent 7 years planning to endure, planning to be patient, planning to make herself small enough that she wouldn't take up space Nathaniel needed. That had been a kind of planning, she supposed. It had taken its own kind of courage, the exhausting, grinding courage of someone who refuses to break even when breaking would be easier. She was done with that kind of courage. She went inside. That evening, Martha spread 3 documents on the kitchen table. The first was the page from the old record book, Eleanor Carver, 42 Acres River, access unclaimed. The second was a letter in a hand Abigail didn't recognize, dated 1804, referencing a legal question about property inheritance and married women in Virginia. The third was a hand-drawn map. "Your grandmother's land," Martha said, touching the map. "It's still there. Hasn't been sold as far as I can determine, which means it's been sitting in legal limbo for 20 years, ever since your mother died, and no one came forward to claim it." "Can I claim it?" Abigail asked. "Not easily," Martha said, "and not alone. You'd need a lawyer who knows property law and isn't on Nathaniel Whitaker's list of associates." She paused. "I know one. He's in Fredericksburg. He's expensive, but he owes me a debt that he knows better than to forget." Elias, who had been sitting in the corner reading and apparently not listening, said without looking up, "I can take her to Fredericksburg. I've got survey work to file there anyway. 2 weeks." Martha looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at the map. At 42 acres, river access, her grandmother's name in faded ink. "I'd like to see a lawyer," she said. Good, Martha said. She folded the map and handed it to Abigail. You should keep that. Abigail took it. She held it for a moment before she folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, close against her side. It weighed almost nothing. It felt like the heaviest thing she'd carried in 7 years. Biek. They left for Fredericksburg on a Tuesday early, before the settlement was fully awake. Elias had a wagon for the survey equipment maps, measuring tools, the documentation that took up more space than the tools themselves. Abigail sat on the bench beside him, with her canvas bag at her feet, and Martha's folded letter of introduction in her pocket. The road north was long and warm, the summer heat building through the morning. They rode in the easy silence that had characterized every interaction she'd had with Elias Boone. Not uncomfortable, not full of things unsaid, just quiet in the way that people are quiet when they don't need noise to fill the space between them. After perhaps an hour, Elias said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," Abigail said. "How long did you know before you left?" She thought about it seriously because the question deserved that. "I think I knew within the first year," she said. "I didn't admit it until the night I left, but I knew." She paused. "I just kept telling myself that love was something you chose, that it didn't require anything back. That being patient was the same as being faithful. That enduring was the same as building something. And now," Elias said, "now I think enduring and building are very different things," she said, "and I wasted a great deal of time confusing one for the other." Elias was quiet for a moment. "My father was a man who confused them the same way," he said. "Endured my mother's unhappiness for 30 years because he thought that was what love required. When she died, he told me he wished he'd been brave enough to fix what was broken instead of just bearing it." Another pause. "That stayed with me." Abigail looked at him. "I'm sorry about your mother." "She was strong," he said simply. "Stronger than anyone gave her credit for. I think she would have liked my Aunt Martha's way of doing things if she'd known it was possible." He shifted the reins slightly. "I think she would have liked you, too." Abigail didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the road moved under them, and the summer woods went by, and somewhere behind them, 15 miles south, a man was sitting in a large empty house, trying to understand how something so convenient had simply gotten up and walked away. They were half a day from Fredericksburg when the second rider found them. This one was not a boy. This one was Thomas Hale, Nathaniel's closest friend, the man who had laughed the loudest in the study that night, the man whose voice she had heard above the others. He was riding hard, coming up fast from the south, and when he saw the wagon, he reined in his horse and came alongside. "Abigail," he said. "Not Mrs. Whitaker, not ma'am, just her name like a claim." "Mr. Hale," she said. Thomas looked at Elias. His jaw was tight. His eyes went back to Abigail. "Nathaniel's coming," he said. "In person." He was going to wait, but Thomas stopped. "He's been talking to the Reverend Mitchell about a wife's legal obligation, about what happens to a woman who abandons her husband's household." The threat underneath those words was not subtle. Abigail heard it clearly. Under Virginia law in 1814, a wife who left without cause could lose what little legal standing she had. The Reverend Mitchell was well connected. Nathaniel Whitaker was well connected. Abigail felt the familiar coldness move through her, the one she had been feeling her whole marriage, the one that came whenever she understood how precisely the world had been designed to make her small. She felt it, and then she did something she had not been able to do for 7 years. She let herself be angry, not shaking, not crying, just angry, clean and clear as river water. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I want you to hear me, and I want you to carry this back to Nathaniel exactly as I say it, the same way I heard what was said in that study 3 weeks ago." She paused to let that land. Thomas's expression shifted, a quick, barely concealed flinch. He hadn't known. He hadn't known that she'd heard. "I have a lawyer's appointment in Fredericksburg," she said. "I have documentation of property that belongs to my family. I have—" She touched the pocket where the folded map sat. "More than you think I have." Tell Nathaniel to speak to me through counsel. Tell him the Reverend Mitchell is welcome to his opinions. Tell him." She held Thomas Hale's eyes steady, unblinking. "That the woman he called convenient has decided to be inconvenient." Thomas stared at her. He looked at Elias, who had said nothing, whose expression was entirely neutral, who was simply holding the reins and watching. Thomas looked back at Abigail. "He's not going to let this go," Thomas said. And this time, Abigail thought she heard something underneath the warning, not quite concern, not quite regret, but something adjacent to both. "I know," she said. "Neither am I." Thomas sat there another moment. Then he pulled his horse around and rode south. Elias watched him go. Then he looked at Abigail. His expression was quiet and careful, and something she might have called respect if she'd had the presence of mind to name it. "Fredericksburg," he said. "Fredericksburg," she agreed. He clicked his tongue to the horse, and the wagon moved forward north into the afternoon, and Abigail sat straight on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, and the folded map pressed against her side like a heartbeat, and she did not look back. She had stopped looking back somewhere around the third day. Some roads, once you've taken them, only go one direction. And the woman sitting on that wagon bench, $11.42 acres, one borrowed introduction to a lawyer in Fredericksburg, was beginning to understand that the direction she was moving was not away from something. It was toward something. She just hadn't learned yet how far she'd have to go to reach it. But she was learning, and learning Abigail Whitaker was beginning to understand was something no man could take from her. Not even the one who had spent 7 years believing she wasn't worth the trouble of knowing. The lawyer's name was Edmund Graft, and he worked out of a narrow office above a dry goods store on the main street of Fredericksburg that smelled of paper and old coffee, and the particular tension of men who made their living knowing things other people didn't. He read Martha's letter twice. Then he looked at Abigail over the top of it with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already figured out. "You're Nathaniel Whitaker's wife," he said. "I was," Abigail said. "Virginia law doesn't quite agree with that tense," Graft said carefully. "Virginia law and I have several disagreements," she said. "That's why I'm here." Elias was sitting in the corner, hat on his knee, saying nothing. He had a talent for making himself functionally invisible in rooms where Abigail needed to take up space, and she was beginning to appreciate it more than she had words for. Graft set the letter down. "Tell me what you know about the Carver property," Abigail told him. She laid it out the way her father had taught her to lay out accounts, facts, first interpretation, after, nothing embellished, nothing omitted. The 42 acres. The river access. Her grandmother, Ruth Carver. Her mother, Eleanor. The year of marriage, the erasure of the family name, the legal limbo that had left the land sitting unclaimed for 2 decades. Graft listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a ledger of his own. Thick cloth covered the spine, cracked with use. "I know the Carver land," he said. "I've known about it for 11 years. I've been waiting for someone with a blood claim to walk through that door." He opened the ledger to a marked page and turned it so she could read. "Your grandmother filed a deed of conditional inheritance in 1793, the same year your mother married. She was, let me put this plainly, she was a woman who understood what marriage did to property rights, and she was trying to protect what she'd built." Abigail leaned forward. "What does conditional inheritance mean?" "It means the land cannot be sold, transferred, or absorbed by any male heir or spouse. It can only pass to a direct female descendant of Ruth Carver, who appears before a court of record with verified lineage and claims it in her own name." Graft looked up. "Your mother never claimed it. Likely didn't know it existed. The deed was filed in a county record office, not advertised, not discussed. Your grandmother was careful about who knew." "My mother never told me," Abigail said. The words came out quiet. "She may not have known," Graft said, not unkindly. "A great many women in her generation were kept deliberately ignorant of property that was theirs, because knowledge is leverage, and leverage was not considered appropriate for wives." Abigail sat with that for a moment. Her grandmother Ruth, a woman she had never met, a woman whose name she hadn't even known until 4 days ago in Martha Boone's front room, had been strategic, had been deliberate, had looked at the world as it was, and built a structure inside it that might 20 years later give her granddaughter somewhere to stand. "Can I claim it?" Abigail asked. "As things stand, married, no legal separation, no husband's permission, can I claim it?" Graft laced his fingers together. "That is the complicated question. I expected it would be. The conditional nature of the deed is actually in your favor," he said. "Because it was filed specifically to exclude spousal transfer, a judge could reasonably interpret it as your grandmother's legal intention to place the property outside of marital jurisdiction. The argument would be that the land was never legally part of any marital estate. Not your mother's, not yours, because the deed explicitly anticipated that scenario and excluded it." "But," Abigail said, "but Nathaniel Whitaker would contest it. And Nathaniel Whitaker has resources and relationships that make contesting things considerably easier than they ought to be." Graft paused. "If he knows about this land—" "He doesn't," Abigail said. "He never asked about my family. He wasn't interested." Something crossed Graft's face that might have been irony. That may be the first time a husband's lack of curiosity has worked in a woman's legal favor. From the corner, Elias made a sound that might have been agreement. "How long would it take?" Abigail asked. "Weeks," Graft said. "Possibly months. I'd need to file in the county where the property sits, which is Shenandoah, not here. I'd need to serve notice Nathaniel would be notified, which means he'd know what you're doing." He paused. "Are you prepared for that?" Abigail thought about Thomas Hale on the road. "He's not going to let this go. He already knows I'm not coming back," she said. "He just doesn't know yet that I have somewhere to go." Graft nodded slowly. "Then let's begin. When?" They were 2 days in Fredericksburg, long enough for Graft to begin the paperwork, long enough for Abigail to visit the county records office herself, and hold the original copy of her grandmother's deed in her hands for the first time. The paper was old and thin, the ink faded but legible. Ruth Carver's signature at the bottom was bold and unhesitating, the signature of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing. Abigail stood at the records clerk's counter and looked at that signature for a long time. The clerk, a young man who had initially looked at her with the particular brand of mild condescension reserved for women, doing things men found inconvenient, eventually stopped pretending to organize papers behind her and said, "Is there something else you need, ma'am?" "No," Abigail said. "I just wanted to see her handwriting." She handed the document back and walked out. Elias was waiting outside. He looked at her face and didn't ask. "She knew," Abigail said. "My grandmother knew what she was doing. She knew what the world would do to my mother, and she built a door out anyway, and then—" Abigail stopped. "And then nobody came through it for 20 years. "You came through it," Elias said. 20 years late." "You came through it," he said again simply, not arguing, just stating. She looked at him. She had been looking at him differently these past few days, not with the cautious suspicion she'd brought to the road, not with the measured gratitude she'd felt in the settlement. Something else. She wasn't ready to name it, and he wasn't pressing her to. "We should head back," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and they went to find the wagon. They were a day south of Fredericksburg, the wagon moving through afternoon heat, when Elias said, "Someone's following us." Abigail didn't turn immediately. She'd learned in the past 2 weeks to trust his read of things. "Since when?" she asked. "Since we left town this morning. Single rider, staying back far enough to not be obvious, close enough to not lose us." "Nathaniel." "Wrong horse, wrong build." A pause. "Could be someone he sent." Abigail thought about Silas Mercer, the business partner, political ally, the third man in the study that night. She hadn't thought about Silas much since she left. She thought about him now. "What do we do?" she asked. "We don't change speed," Elias said. "We don't give him any reason to think we've noticed. There's a way station about 3 miles ahead where we can stop for water public people around. If he follows us, there we'll see his face. If he doesn't, he'll wait on the road." He shifted the reins. "Either way, we'll know more than we do now." Abigail sat with that. With the deliberate normalcy of it, the casual competence of a man who had spent years reading frontiers and the particular dangers they held. "You're very calm about this," she said. "Being calm is useful," he said. "Being scared is also useful depending on the situation. Right now, calm is more useful." "Are you ever scared?" He looked at her sideways. "Frequently," he said. "Just not about the things most men think are worth being scared of." She might have asked him what he meant, but the way station appeared around the bend, and there were 2 other wagons already there, a family with children running in the yard, a man watering horses. Ordinary busy witnessed. They pulled in. Elias helped the horse to water, and Abigail stood in the yard and watched the road. The rider came around the bend 4 minutes later. He pulled up at the edge of the way station and looked at the yard, and Abigail saw his face and her stomach dropped straight through the ground. It was not Silas Mercer. It was Nathaniel. He looked different than she remembered, which was strange because it had only been 3 weeks. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well, the particular drawn quality around the eyes, the jaw set too tight. He was dressed for travel, not for the estate, which meant he had come a long way and come himself without the performance of sending someone else first. That scared her more than anything else so far, because the Nathaniel she knew sent people. The Nathaniel she knew managed things from a distance. The Nathaniel who appeared at a way station south of Fredericksburg on a summer afternoon alone, having followed her wagon for 30 miles. That was a different Nathaniel. One she didn't have a map for. He dismounted and walked into the yard. His eyes found her immediately. "Abigail," he said. His voice was the same, measured, in control. It had always been in control, that voice, right up until it was laughing at her in the study and thinking she'd never know. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at Elias. Something moved across his face, not quite what she'd call jealousy, because that would have implied she was something he valued rather than something he owned. More like the irritation of a man whose property has been touched by someone else's hands. "I need to speak with my wife," he said to Elias. Elias looked at Abigail. "It's all right," she said. Elias nodded once and led the horse further into the yard, far enough to be out of earshot, close enough to be present. She appreciated the precision of it. Nathaniel came to stand in front of her. He studied her face the way he studied accounts, looking for the place where the numbers didn't add up. "You look well," he said, which was not what he'd meant to say. She could tell. He'd meant to start differently, and her composure had thrown him off. "I am well," she said. "Thank you." "Abigail," he exhaled. "Come home." "No," she said. The word was small and clear and absolute, and she watched it land on him like something he had not prepared for. He had prepared for argument, for tears, for the particular feminine distress he knew how to manage. He had not prepared for no stated simply without apology. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "Reverend Mitchell has already spoken to me. The county will see this as abandonment. Your reputation." "My reputation," she said, "was managed by me for 7 years while you enjoyed the results without ever once acknowledging the labor." She kept her voice even. "What Reverend Mitchell thinks of me is his business. What I think of myself is mine." "This man," Nathaniel said, and the word man carried a weight of dismissal she recognized well. "Whoever he is, he doesn't know you. He doesn't know what you need. He doesn't need to know what I need," she said. "That's rather the point." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. The studied composure slipped just slightly, just enough for her to see what was underneath it. Not grief, not love, something colder than either. "I heard about Fredericksburg," he said. "I heard about a lawyer." There it was. "I thought you might," she said. "Abigail." His voice changed. Lower, almost quiet. the voice he used when he wanted to sound like the most reasonable person in any room. Whatever you think you found, whatever old document someone's been waving in front of you, it won't hold up. I have relationships with every judge in 3 counties. You know that. I do know that, she said. I also know that the deed my grandmother filed was specifically designed to be outside your jurisdiction, which means your relationships with judges may be less useful than you're accustomed to. She paused. Mr. Graft explained it quite clearly. Nathaniel was quiet. She had never seen him genuinely quiet before. Not the practiced pauses he used when he wanted to seem thoughtful, but actual silence, the silence of a man who had just discovered the ground wasn't where he'd thought it was. "What do you want?" he said finally. "I want my grandmother's land," she said. "I want my name, not yours. I want to not come back to that house." She held his eyes. "And I want you to leave me alone to build something of my own without spending my energy managing your discomfort about it." "I could fight you in court for years," he said. And it was not a threat exactly, more like a man reading a map aloud laying out territory. "You could," she agreed. "And it would cost you money and time and eventually the kind of public attention that courts tend to generate. People would want to know why Nathaniel Whitaker is fighting his wife over 42 acres of Shenandoah land." She tilted her head slightly. "I think you know that story doesn't make you look the way you'd like." The family across the yard, mother, father, 3 children, were doing a poor job of pretending not to watch. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. And then something happened that she had not anticipated in any version of this conversation she had played out in her head on the long road north. His expression shifted. Not to anger, not to the cold control she knew so well. To something she had no framework for, because she had never seen it on his face before. Something that looked distantly like the earliest possible beginning of understanding. 7 years, he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't quite an accusation. It sat somewhere between the two, in the territory of a man confronting arithmetic he didn't like. 7 years, she confirmed. He looked down. He looked back up. The composure was back, but it was thinner now, like ice in early spring, still holding, but not something you'd want to put weight on. "I'll hear from Graff's office," he said. "You will." He stood there another moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted without looking at her again. He rode north on the road back toward Fredericksburg, which meant he was not heading home, which meant she had no idea what he was going to do next. Elias appeared at her shoulder. "You all right?" he said quietly. "My hands are shaking again," she said. "You want to sit down?" "No," she said. "I want to keep moving." "Then let's keep moving," he said, and brought the wagon around. They reached Dunmore Settlement 2 days later in the late afternoon, the kind of late afternoon in Virginia summer that turns everything gold and makes the world look like a painting of itself. Martha was in the yard. She took one look at Abigail's face and said, "He found you on the road." "How did you know?" "Because you look like someone who's been in a fight and won, but isn't quite sure yet that it's over," Martha said. "Was he alone?" "Yes." "That means he's thinking," Martha said. "A man who sends people has made up his mind. A man who comes himself is still working something out." She took Abigail's bag from her shoulder without asking. "Come inside. Tell me everything." Abigail told her everything. Martha listened, the way she always listened, without interruption, without visible reaction, her hands still in her lap and her eyes steady. When Abigail finished, Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He asked you what you want." "Yes." "And you told him?" "Yes." "Good," Martha said. A woman who knows what she wants and can say it plainly is the most frightening thing in the world to a man who spent his life deciding for everyone around him. He'll be unsettled for a while. She paused. The question is whether unsettled becomes dangerous. "He mentioned judges," Abigail said. "He'll mention them again," Martha said. "But Graft filed in Shenandoah County, not Whitaker's County. That's deliberate." Nathaniel's reach isn't infinite, it just feels that way from inside it. She looked at Abigail directly. Do you trust graft? I trust your debt, Abigail said. Martha smiled, the first full smile Abigail had seen from her, broad and real. That's the right answer. Young. The letter arrived from Graft's office 8 days later. Abigail was helping a young woman named Dora Sims, 19, 2 months, arrived at the settlement. Circumstances Martha had described only as difficult work through the household accounts Martha kept for the settlement's trading. Abigail had been teaching Dora to read a ledger for the past 4 days, and Dora had turned out to have a mind like a trap, sharp, quick, hungry. She reminded Abigail of herself at 19, except Dora had arrived in a place where someone was actively handing her tools instead of locking them away. The boy who brought the letter was from Graft's office, not from Whitaker, and the distinction mattered. Abigail took it outside to read. The letter was 2 pages dense with legal language she had to read slowly. But the substance of it was this: Graft had filed the claim. The Shenandoah County Court had received it. Notice had been served to Nathaniel Whitaker as required, and Nathaniel had not filed a counterclaim. Not yet. Graft was careful to say not yet. But the window for immediate contestation had passed without action, and that silence Graft wrote was not insignificant. Abigail read the letter 3 times. Then she went back inside and sat down next to Dora and looked at the ledger for a long moment. Good news? Dora asked. Possibly, Abigail said. What does possibly good news feel like? Abigail thought about it. Like standing on ice that you're pretty sure will hold, she said, and deciding to take a step anyway. Dora nodded slowly. I reckon that's most things worth doing, she said. Abigail looked at her, this 19-year-old woman, with the quick mind and the careful eyes, sitting in Martha Boone's front room, learning to read numbers that no one had ever thought to teach her, and felt something move through her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. Something that came before happiness. The sense of a direction. The sense of a self that had been folded down very small for a very long time, beginning slowly, carefully, with both hands to unfold. Show me that column again, she said to Dora. The one with the trading entries. You added them wrong on the 3rd row. Dora bent over the ledger. Abigail bent over it with her, and outside the window across the settlement yard, Elias Boone was walking from the barn toward the grist mill with a roll of survey maps under his arm, and he glanced toward the blue-shuttered house as he passed, and he stopped for a moment when he saw her through the window, bent over the table, teaching, and something moved across his face that was quiet and sure and absolutely certain. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once to himself and kept walking. 3 days after the letter, Silas Mercer rode into the settlement. Not alone this time. He had 2 men with him. Men she didn't recognize. Men who had the particular look of people paid to stand in a certain direction. Abigail was in the yard when he arrived. She had been expecting Nathaniel. She had been preparing herself for Nathaniel, his voice, his composure, his particular talent for making her feel like the disruption in an otherwise orderly arrangement. Silas was different. Silas was not Nathaniel's proxy exactly, but he was Nathaniel's ally, which in some ways was more difficult because Silas had no particular personal history with her. He had no complicated feelings to navigate. He was simply an instrument of pressure. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, and the name landed like a hand pressed flat on something she'd been trying to lift. Mr. Mercer, she said. He dismounted. The 2 men stayed mounted, which was a choice, a visible choice. I'm here on Nathaniel's behalf, he said. Unofficially. I assumed, she said. He's prepared to be reasonable, Silas said. He's prepared to let the Carver property claim proceed without contest. Abigail waited. In exchange for your agreement to return to the estate, 6 months. A period of... Silas seemed to select the word carefully, reconciliation. After 6 months, if both parties agree, the separation can be formalized quietly. No courts, no public record. He said it the way Nathaniel would have said it, like he was offering her something generous, like she should be grateful. "He wants me back for 6 months," Abigail said. "It protects both of your reputations," Silas said. It allows him to demonstrate to Reverend Mitchell and everyone else in the county that his wife came home," Abigail said. "It gives him back the image I maintained for 7 years. The dinner table, the servants, the social calendar. The woman who looked at him like he hung the moon." She paused. "And in exchange I get land that is already legally mine." Silas's jaw moved slightly. "It's not legally. Mr. Graff disagrees," she said. Silence. One of the mounted men shifted. The horse moved. "Tell Nathaniel," Abigail said, and her voice was completely steady, so steady it surprised her, "that I am not available for purchase, not even with something that was already mine." She held Silas Mercer's eyes. "And tell him that the next communication I'm willing to receive from him is through legal counsel in writing, with terms that don't include my returning to a house where I was furniture." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, and she knew without turning that Elias had appeared behind her. She'd heard the particular sound of his boots on the hard-packed yard. He hadn't spoken. He was simply there, the same way he'd been there on the road, taking up space without demanding anything from it. "This isn't over," Silas said. "I didn't think it was," Abigail said. "But this part of it is." Silas mounted his horse. He looked at her one more time. Not with contempt, she realized, but with something more complicated than that. With the particular look of a man who has spent a long time operating a certain way, and has just encountered a wall where he expected an open door. He rode south with his 2 men behind him. Abigail stood in the yard until the sound of the horses faded. Then she turned. Elias was standing 6 feet behind her. He hadn't moved. His expression was the careful, quiet thing it always was, but his eyes, when they met hers, held something she recognized. Not pity, not admiration. Recognition. The look of a person who sees another person clearly and finds what they see genuinely worthy of seeing. "He'll come back," Elias said. "I know," she said. "You know what you're going to say when he does." Abigail looked south where the dust of the horses was settling back to the road. "I know exactly what I'm going to say," she said. "I've known it since the night I walked out." She turned back. "I just needed to make sure I had somewhere to stand when I said it." She walked back toward the blue-shuttered house. Behind her, Elias Boone stood in the yard for a moment longer, looking at nothing in particular, in the way a man looks when something he'd given up believing in has just walked back into the world and decided to stay. Then he followed her inside. The second letter from Graff arrived on a Thursday morning, and it changed everything. Abigail was at the writing desk. Martha's desk, which Martha had quietly ceded to her 3 weeks ago, without ceremony or explanation, simply moving her own papers to the kitchen table one morning, and saying nothing about it, the way Martha did most generous things when the boy knocked. She took the letter, thanked him, and read it standing up, because she'd learned by now that Graff's letters were not the kind you sat down for. Sitting down for them gave them too much power over your body. She read it once, then again. Then she set it on the desk and pressed both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Nathaniel had filed, not a counterclaim on the land, which was what she'd expected what Graff had prepared her for. Something else entirely. He had filed a petition with the county court, alleging that Abigail had abandoned the marital home without cause, that she was residing in the company of an unmarried man, the name Elias Boone, written out in full, in a document that would now be part of the public record, and that the court should compel her return to the Whitaker estate, pending formal review of her mental and moral fitness. Mental and moral fitness. She stared at those words for a long time. She had known Nathaniel was capable of cruelty. She had lived inside that cruelty for 7 years. The quiet, daily kind, the kind that doesn't leave marks anyone else can see. But this was different. This was public. This was deliberate. This was a man who had decided that if he could not bring her back through persuasion or negotiation, he would bring her back through humiliation. He was going to make her a question that people asked about in church. She picked up the letter and walked to find Martha. Martha read it without a word. When she finished, she set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at a problem you've seen in different forms many times before and have learned not to be surprised by. "He's escalating," Abigail said. "Because I didn't come back when Silas came." "Yes," Martha said. "The moral fitness petition, if the court accepts it." "The court won't accept it," Martha said. "Graft won't let it get that far. That's what I mean by the debt he owes me. It isn't a social debt, it's a specific documented legal debt. Graft will file a response that buries Nathaniel's petition in procedural stone before a judge ever reads it." "But Elias's name is in the public record now," Abigail said. Martha was quiet for a moment. "Yes, that's the real purpose of it," Abigail said. She was working it through as she said it the way her father had taught her to work through a bad set of accounts. Follow the logic, find the intention behind the numbers. "He's not trying to get me back through the court. He's trying to make me a problem for Elias. He's trying to give Elias a reason to ask me to leave." Martha looked at her steadily. "That's a sharp read." "It's a Nathaniel read," Abigail said. "I spent 7 years learning how he thinks." She sat down. "He doesn't fight directly. He creates conditions that make other people do what he wants. Then we need to tell Elias before he hears it from someone else." Abigail closed her eyes briefly. "Open them." "Yes," she said. "We do." Elias came in from the survey field at midday, covered in trail dust, carrying his maps, the way he always carried them, rolled under his arm, protected from the weather, even when he wasn't. Abigail met him in the yard. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. He read it the same way she had, once fast, once slow. His expression didn't change, which she'd learned to read not as absence of feeling, but as the presence of a great deal of it being held very deliberately. When he finished, he handed it back. "You already talked to Martha," he said. "Yes." "And Graft can handle the legal piece." "That's what Martha believes." He nodded. He looked out across the yard for a moment toward the grist mill, toward the settlement that was already stirring with midday activity. People moving between buildings, 2 women talking near the well, a child running with a dog at his heels. "My name being in that document," he said. "That's going to travel faster than any court filing." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." He looked at her sharply. "Don't apologize for something he did." "I brought this here," she said. "You brought yourself here," he said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Abigail, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "All right," she said. "Are you scared of him?" She thought about it honestly. "Not the way I was at first," she said. "At first I was scared of what he could do. Now I'm more," she chose the word carefully, "wary. Like you are with a person who has a long reach and no particular conscience about how they use it." "That's a healthy kind of scared," Elias said. "It's the kind that keeps you thinking." He looked back at the letter. "He's going to come himself. Not Silas this time. Not a boy on a horse. Him." "I know. Have you thought about what you'll say?" "I've thought about almost nothing else for 4 days," she said. "But thinking about it and doing it are—" She stopped. "Different things," he said. "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said in the same even tone he used for everything, "When he comes, and he's coming, I'd put money on it before the week's out, I'll be here. Not in front of you. Not speaking for you. Just here." He paused. "Because a man like Nathaniel Whitaker reads everything around a woman as part of her value. And I want him to read that you're not alone without reading that you need someone to hold you up." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. "That's exactly the right distinction," she said quietly. "I've had time to think about it," he said, and the smallest edge of something almost like humor moved through his voice, and she almost smiled, which felt like a remarkable thing to almost do, standing in a dusty yard with her husband's legal filing in her hand. Nathaniel came on a Saturday. He came alone. This time, no Thomas, no Silas, no hired men behind him. Just Nathaniel Whitaker on a good horse dressed well, because Nathaniel was always dressed well, because appearance was the first argument he made in any room he entered. Abigail was inside when she heard the horse. She heard it the way she had always heard sounds that meant Nathaniel with a particular readiness in her chest, bracing the old automatic response of a woman who had spent years calibrating herself to a man's arrival. She let the readiness sit there. She didn't fight it. She just noted it the way Martha had taught her to note things. There it is. It's just a feeling. It's not an instruction. Then she stood up and went outside. Nathaniel was in the yard. Elias was 20 feet away near the barn, working with a length of rope and not looking up. Nathaniel looked at Elias, then at Abigail. "I want to speak with you privately," he said. "No," she said. "Whatever you have to say, you can say here." His jaw moved. "Abigail, you put Elias Boone's name in a public legal document," she said. "You made this settlement part of your campaign. That means this settlement is where this conversation happens." She folded her hands in front of her, easy and deliberate. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" He looked at her for a long moment. The studied composure was there, but it was working harder than she'd ever seen it work. There were things moving underneath it, and she found to her own mild surprise that she was not afraid of them. "I want you to come home," he said. "I'm asking you. Not through lawyers, not through Silas. I'm asking you directly." A pause. "That ought to mean something." "It means you've run out of other options," she said. "That's what it means." Something flickered in his eyes. "I made mistakes," he said, and the words came out like something being pulled rather than offered. "I know I made mistakes." "Do you?" she said, not unkindly, genuinely. "I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't—" Another stop. "I know what you heard that night, in the study." "Good," she said. "Then we don't have to have that particular argument." "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," he said. The old Abigail, the Abigail who had spent 7 years making herself smaller in hopes that making peace would eventually make love, would have heard that sentence and felt the dangerous pull of it. The familiar hope, the terrible resilience of a heart that wants to believe. This Abigail heard it and recognized it for what it was. Not a man who had changed. A man who had lost something convenient and was trying to recover it with the only tools he knew how to use. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, "I'm going to say something to you, and I need you to actually hear it." She waited until his eyes steadied on hers. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because loving you had required me every day to love myself less. To make myself quieter, smaller, easier, more convenient. To pretend I didn't understand things I understood perfectly. To be grateful for a life that was actually mine to begin with." She paused. "I spent 7 years disappearing. And the night in the study, I realized you had not only noticed, you had been counting on it." Nathaniel was silent. From the barn 20 feet away, the sound of the rope in Elias's hands had stopped. "You don't miss me," she continued. "You miss what I did. The household, the dinner table, the way the servants ran because I told them how, the way your social calendar arranged itself because I arranged it. The way you appeared to the county because I managed your appearance." She held his eyes. "I'm not angry about the labor. I'm angry that you called it convenient, that you told Thomas and Silas it made me easy to manage, that you never once in 7 years looked at what I was doing and recognized it as work." A long silence. Nathaniel looked down at the ground, then up. "I didn't know how to," he started. "I know," she said. And she meant it. "That's the saddest part of it, Nathaniel. I don't think you're cruel by intention. I think you simply never looked at me long enough to see me, and I kept being so grateful for whatever attention you did give me that I never made you look." She breathed. "That's on both of us, but I'm done with my part of it." He stood there. He looked, she thought, like a man in the middle of an open field, who has just realized the map he's been using was drawn for a different place entirely. Not devastated, not remorseful, not yet, and possibly not ever, but genuinely, for perhaps the first time in all her years of knowing him, uncertain. "The land," he said finally. "The Carver claim." "I'm not negotiating the land," she said. "It's my grandmother's. It's mine. That piece isn't a discussion." And he glanced involuntarily toward the barn, toward Elias. "Him is not your concern," she said, "any more than your business dealings are mine." He looked back at her. "The court petition. Withdraw it," she said simply. "Not for my sake, for yours. A man who files a moral fitness petition against a woman whose only crime was leaving gets looked at a certain way. You know that as well as I do." She kept her voice steady and even. "Withdraw it. Let Graft handle the land claim without opposition. Let me go Nathaniel, without a fight. And in 10 years' time, when people in this county ask what became of the Whitaker marriage, you can say it ended quietly and both parties moved on." She paused. "Or we can do it the hard way, and people will ask a great many more questions." The sun had moved while they were talking. Abigail could feel the heat of it on her shoulder, the solid warmth of a Virginia summer afternoon pressing down on the world. Nathaniel looked at her for a very long time, and then quietly, with no drama, with none of the performance she might have expected from a man who performed everything, he said, "All right." 2 words. Abigail felt them land somewhere deep and careful and long closed. "I'll contact Graft," Nathaniel said. "This week." He picked up the reins. He looked at her one final time, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen there before. Something that might have been the thing he was capable of when he wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't managing anything, wasn't being the charming landowner for Thomas and Silas's benefit. Something quieter, and she thought lonelier than any version of him she had known. "You were never easy to manage," he said. "For what it's worth." She said nothing. He turned the horse and rode south. Abigail stood in the yard until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Then her knees did something that was not quite shaking, but was adjacent to it, and she sat down on the mounting block near the fence, and she pressed her hands over her face, and she breathed. She heard boots on the ground. Elias sat down beside her, not touching, just close, and was quiet. After a moment she lowered her hands. Her face was dry. She had not cried. "He said all right," she said. "I heard," Elias said. "I don't entirely trust it." "That's reasonable," he said. "But Graft will, the paper trail will." "Yes." She looked at her hands. I thought it would feel different. I thought it would feel bigger." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I think the big feeling already happened," he said. "I think it happened the night you put your ring on the dresser. Everything since has just been—" He paused, searching for the world catching up to a decision you'd already made. She looked at him sideways. "That's either very wise or very simple," she said. "Most true things are both," he said. She almost laughed. It came out as an exhale, warm and real, and somewhere in the middle of it, without quite deciding to, she leaned her shoulder against his, just briefly, just long enough to feel the solidity of another person who was not measuring her, not managing her, not calculating her usefulness. He didn't move away. Damn. 3 days later, Graft sent word that Nathaniel had contacted his office. The petition was being withdrawn. The land claim would proceed unopposed. Graft estimated a final ruling within 6 weeks. Abigail read the letter at the kitchen table with Martha across from her and Dora Sims beside her, because Dora had been sleeping in the back room for a week now, having arrived from a situation Martha described only as requiring immediate relocation, and had become in that week a quiet and indispensable presence in the blue-shuttered house. 6 weeks, Abigail said. 6 weeks and the land is yours, Martha said. In your name, in the county record. Dora said, and then what? Abigail looked at her. The question was simple and enormous. And then I go there, Abigail said. I go see it. I find out what 42 acres of river access Virginia land needs, and I figure out how to give it that. She paused. I've been managing someone else's property for 7 years. I think I know how to manage my own. You'll need help, Martha said. You know that. I know. Abigail looked around the kitchen, at the ledger on the desk, at the jars of dried herbs, at Dora's face, at Martha's steady eyes. I've been thinking about that. And she took a breath. The settlement here, it's good. It's doing good work. But it's one place. There are women in every county in this state who don't know what Martha knows, who don't have access to what Graft has, who have never held a deed or a ledger, or been told they were capable of understanding one. She looked at her hands. My grandmother built a structure for me in 1793 and put it in a record book and waited for me to show up. She didn't know if I ever would. She just believed that a woman who needed it would come eventually. Martha was very still. I want to do what she did, Abigail said. Not just for me, for... She glanced at Dora, for whoever comes after. Martha reached across the table and put her hand over Abigail's. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The following week, a woman named Harriet Soules arrived at the settlement from 2 counties east, traveling alone on a borrowed mule with a letter of introduction from a woman Martha knew in Culpeper. Harriet was 43, broad-shouldered and cautious-eyed, and she had spent the last 20 years running the accounts for her husband's mill without being credited for any of it, and she had been told by 3 different people that a woman named Abigail in Dunmore Settlement might know what to do with someone like her. Abigail was in the yard when Harriet arrived. She looked at this woman, this tired, careful, capable woman who had ridden 2 counties on a borrowed mule because she'd heard that somewhere there was a place that might receive her, and she felt something she was beginning to recognize as her clearest purpose. You're Abigail, Harriet said. Not a question. I am, Abigail said. Harriet looked at her steadily, with the particular look of a woman who has been disappointed enough times to have stopped hoping easily. They said you might be able to help me. I might, Abigail said. Come inside. Tell me what you can do, not what you've been allowed to do. What you can actually do. Harriet blinked. That's an unusual way to ask. I know, Abigail said. It's the right way. She held the door open. I learned it from someone who was smarter than I was. Harriet walked inside. Abigail followed her. And behind them, through the window, Martha Boone stood at her kitchen table, watching the yard. And she was thinking about a woman named Ruth Carver, who had pressed her name into a county record book in 1793, and believed without evidence, without guarantee on nothing, but the pure, stubborn faith of a woman who understood how the world worked and refused to let it be the last word that somewhere down the line someone would come looking for what she'd left behind. She'd been right. She was always right. Martha turned back to her ledger and added a new name. The ruling came on a Wednesday. Abigail was teaching when the boy arrived. 3 women around Martha's kitchen table, Dora and Harriet, and a young widow named Clara Voss, who had come from the North Fork of the Shenandoah with nothing but a child on her hip, and the particular determined silence of someone who has decided that whatever comes next has to be better than what came before. Abigail was walking them through a property assessment form, the kind Graft had sent over as a template, the kind that most women in Virginia had never seen, because most women in Virginia had been carefully kept from understanding that such forms existed. She heard the horse. She heard the knock. Martha opened the door and came back with the envelope and set it on the table without a word. Every woman in the room went still. Abigail picked it up. She read it standing the way she always read Graff's letters, now on her feet, because standing meant she was already ready for whatever the words said. The Shenandoah County Court of Record hereby confirms the deed of conditional inheritance filed by Ruth Carver in 1793 as valid and binding. The claim of Abigail, granddaughter of Ruth Carver, to the described 42 acres with river access is recognized. Title transfers effective the date of this ruling. No contesting claim has been filed. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table. Dora said, "Well, it's mine," Abigail said. The kitchen was quiet for 1 full second. Then Clara Voss, who had said almost nothing in 4 days, and had the careful stillness of a woman who had learned to take up very little space, put her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders moved. She was not crying exactly. It was something more complicated than crying, the sound a person makes when something they had stopped believing was possible turns out to be real after all. Harriet reached across the table and gripped Abigail's hand. Martha, standing in the doorway, said nothing. She turned and went to the shelf where she kept a bottle of good bourbon she claimed was for medicinal purposes, and poured 5 glasses without being asked. They drank together, the 5 of them, in Martha Boone's kitchen on a Wednesday morning in the summer of 1815, and outside the settlement went about its business, and the world did not pause or mark the occasion, because the world rarely paused to mark the occasions that mattered most to women. But in that kitchen they knew. Elias found her in the yard an hour later. She was sitting on the fence rail, a thing she never would have done at the Whitaker estate, where women sat in chairs with their backs straight and their hands arranged, and she was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone whose mind is moving very fast through very large territory. "Graft sent word to me too," he said. "Congratulations." "Thank you," she said. She looked at him. "I need to go see it." "The land." "Yes. I've been making plans for 42 acres I've never laid eyes on." "That seems—" She paused, backwards. "It does," he agreed. He leaned against the fence. "I have survey work in Shenandoah County next month. I could read the land for you. Tell you what it'll need, what it'll bear." She looked at him. "You've been saying things like that lately." "Like what?" "Things that tell me you're planning to be around." She said it directly without cushioning, because she had spent 7 years not saying direct things, and was done with that particular habit. Something shifted in Elias's expression. Not surprised, she'd come to understand that very little surprised him. Something more careful than surprise. Something that had been held quietly for a long time, and was being held still, but less tightly. "I reckon I have been," he said. "I'm not the woman I was when I came here," she said. "I need you to know that. I'm not looking to replace what I left. I'm not looking for someone to organize my life around." "I know that," he said. "And I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions about accounts and property law, and the way women get told to be grateful for things that were already theirs. I have plans that involve a great deal of work and very little sitting quietly at supper tables. Abigail." His voice was quiet and direct. "I rode next to you for 15 miles in the dark the night we met. I watched you send a messenger back empty-handed. I watched you face your husband in a way station yard with your hands shaking and your voice steady. I watched you turn down an offer that would have given you the land and cost you everything else." He paused. "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for real." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a dangerous thing to say to a woman who's just been handed 42 acres and a significant amount of unspent ambition," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the edge of that quiet humor moved through his voice. "I'm aware." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had offered direction, not rescue, who had stood behind her and never in front of her, who had said running is easy, planning is what takes courage on a dark road, and then proved it by showing up every single time without being asked. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Ask you what? Whatever it is you've been not asking for 6 weeks," she said. "Ask me." He was quiet for a breath. Then, "When you go to the Carver land, when you see it and figure out what it needs, I'd like to be there for that. Not to tell you what to do with it, just to be there." He paused. "And after that, whatever you decide to build, whatever that looks like, I'd like to be part of it, if you'll have me." Abigail felt something settle in her chest. Not the frantic, hopeful feeling she'd had at 20, marrying Nathaniel, with her whole heart thrown forward like a bet. Something steadier than that. Something that knew its own weight. "I'll have you," she said. He nodded once, the way he received most significant things quietly, without performance. Then he held out his hand. She took it. Not like a woman accepting rescue, like a woman choosing a partner. There was a difference. She had learned it the hard way, and she would not forget it. 2 weeks later, Abigail stood on her grandmother's land for the first time. 42 acres. River access. A meadow gone wild with summer grass, an old stone foundation, where a house had once stood, a tree line of oak and hickory that Elias told her would be worth something in timber if she chose that direction, though he offered the information without recommendation, the way he offered everything. She stood at the edge of the meadow and felt the land under her feet. She had expected something ceremonial about it. Some internal music, some arrival of emotion proportionate to the significance. What she felt instead was simpler and more real than that. She felt the ground. Solid, particular, summer warm hers. She felt it the way you feel a chair that fits, not thrilling, just exactly right. "What do you see?" Elias asked, standing beside her. "Work," she said. "What kind?" "The good kind," she said. "The kind that makes something." She walked the perimeter of the meadow, Elias beside her, with his surveying compass, calling out measurements and angles that she wrote in the small notebook she'd taken to carrying. The old stone foundation was sound someone had built here who knew how to build. The river ran clear and cold along the eastern edge, which meant water for crops, for livestock, for the things she was beginning to think about building. Not just a house, not just a farm, something larger than that. She was in the middle of explaining it to Elias, the outline of it, the early rough shape of what lived in her mind when she heard the horse. She turned. Thomas Hale was riding across the meadow toward them alone, at a pace that said he wasn't looking for a confrontation. He pulled up 10 feet away and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something uncomfortable, something that had been working on him for a while. "Miss Abigail," he said. "Mr. Hale." He glanced at Elias. Elias was standing slightly behind and to the side, close present, not interfering. Thomas looked back at Abigail. "I came from Nathaniel," he said, "but what I'm saying now is from me." She waited. "The night in the study," he said. The words came out like something he'd been carrying at a bad angle for a long time, and finally set down. "I laughed. I want you to know I know that. I laughed, and I didn't think about what it meant because—" He stopped, "because it was easier not to." He looked at the ground briefly, then back up. "I've got a wife. Eleanor. She runs our household the same way you ran Nathaniel's, and I've never once asked her about it. Never once said—" He stopped again. His jaw was tight. "I just wanted to say it to your face. I'm sorry." The silence stretched. Abigail looked at him. This man who had sat in a circle of easy laughter and called it friendship, who had never once considered the cost of the comfort he'd been living in, and she felt no particular desire to make it easier for him. But she also felt surprisingly no desire to make it harder. "Did you tell Eleanor?" she said. Thomas blinked. "What?" "Did you tell your wife what I just told you? That you're sorry?" He was quiet. "That's where it matters, Mr. Hale," Abigail said. "Not here. Not to me." She paused. "I appreciate you coming. I do. But the apology that will actually change something isn't the one you owe me." Thomas sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded a slow, genuine nod, the kind that means a person has actually heard something. He touched his hat. He turned his horse. He rode back the way he had come. Elias said beside her, "That was generous." "It was practical," she said. "I don't need his guilt. Eleanor might need his honesty." She turned back to her notebook. "Now, tell me about the eastern tree line again." Beg. The letter from Nathaniel came 3 days after she returned to Dunmore's settlement. It was not through graft this time. It was a personal letter, handwritten, 4 pages, the longest thing Nathaniel had ever written to her in 7 years of marriage. She knew that without even counting, because she had carried every letter he'd ever written her in a bundle tied with kitchen twine at the bottom of that canvas bag, and the bundle was thin. She sat with the letter for a long time before she opened it. Martha asked from across the room, "Do you want privacy?" "No," Abigail said. "Stay." She opened it. She read all 4 pages. When she finished, she sat quietly for a moment. "What does it say?" Martha asked. "He's leaving Virginia," Abigail said. "He's accepted a business arrangement in Charleston. He's selling the estate." She paused, the papers balanced in her hands. "He says," she looked at the page, reading carefully. "He says that he spent a month after I left trying to understand what the house felt like without me, and that what he realized was that it had never felt like anything at all, that he'd been living in a house, not a home, and that the difference was something I'd been making every day, without credit or acknowledgement, and that he understood finally the scale of what he'd taken for granted." She was quiet. "He says he hopes the land is everything it ought to be. He says," her voice shifted just slightly, "he says he hopes I am everything I ought to be." Martha was very still. "He says he's not asking for anything," Abigail continued. "Not forgiveness, not response. He says he's writing it because a man he'd never have expected told him that you don't fix what you've broken by pretending the breaking didn't happen. You fix it by saying clearly what you did and then getting out of the way of the person you damaged so they can build something without your shadow on it." Martha said quietly, "Who told him that?" Abigail looked up. "He says it was Thomas Hale." The kitchen was very quiet. Then Martha made a sound, not quite a laugh, but related to one. "Well," she said, "people do surprise you." Abigail folded the letter. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on the table beside the ruling from Shenandoah County. Those two pieces of paper side by side, one telling her what she'd won, and one telling her what she'd finally been seen. "I'm not going to respond," she said. "No," Martha agreed. "He doesn't need me to, and I don't need to." She pushed the letter aside gently. "He gets to live with what he understands now. I get to live with what I'm building." She looked at Martha. "Those are both fair outcomes." Martha looked at her for a long moment. "Your grandmother," she said, "would have said the same thing, word for word." Abigail didn't have an answer for that. She just sat with it, the weight of being descended from a woman she'd never met, who had believed in her sight unseen, and left her a door and trusted her to find it. That was its own kind of love. She was beginning to understand that love had more shapes than she'd been taught. By September of 1815, the stone foundation on the Carver land had a new frame on top of it. Elias had drawn the plans. Abigail had approved them, modified 3 structural decisions based on her reading of the land and the practical needs she'd outlined, and then watched men from 2 settlements come to raise the frame in a single day. The way frontier people raised things together, because alone it couldn't be done, and because what benefited one piece of land eventually benefited all the surrounding ones. It was not a grand house. It was a working house. Large kitchen, 2 rooms for records and consultation, a sleeping loft, a proper cellar for storage. It was built for function, and it was built to last. And when Abigail walked through it at the end of the first day of framing, she ran her hand along the wood the way her grandmother's signature had run along the bottom of a legal document in 1793, with intention, with permanence, with the full understanding of what she was claiming. Martha came to see it a week later when the walls were up and the roof was on. She walked through every room without speaking. She touched the door frames, looked at the shelves. Abigail had already begun filling books, ledgers, the labeled jars that were becoming her own language the way they were Martha's. She stood in the consultation room for a long time. Then she turned to Abigail and said, "What are you going to call it?" Abigail had been thinking about that for weeks. She'd turned a dozen names over: the Carver house, the crossing. Her own name attached to things the way Elias's name had been attached to the settlement. But none of them had settled. "Ruth's Crossing," she said, "after my grandmother." Martha's expression moved, just slightly, just enough. "She'd have been difficult about that," Martha said. "She always said names were for after, not during." "I know," Abigail said. "She'd have been right to say it." She looked at the room around her, at the shelves, the writing table, the window that faced east toward the river, toward the 42 acres that now had a house and a purpose and a plan. But she's been patient long enough. Dora Sims came to Ruth's Crossing in October, the first woman to stay in the new house. She came not as someone in crisis. She had pulled herself out of crisis steadily and with great determination over the course of the months she'd spent in Martha's settlement, but as someone with purpose. She had a clear hand and quick arithmetic, and she wanted to learn property law the way Abigail was learning it from the inside out, from the documents up. Abigail taught her. Harriet Soules came next, and then Clara Voss, and then 3 women in November that Graft sent from Fredericksburg, women who needed someone who understood what they were facing and had the tools and the legal connections to actually help. By the first hard frost of the season, Ruth's Crossing had a reputation that traveled faster than any road. Women came from 2 counties. 3. Abigail did not rescue them. She did what Martha had done and what Ruth Carver had done before, that she gave them information access and the particular radical gift of being treated as though their intelligence was a given. She helped them read their own documents, understand their own situations, make their own decisions. Some of them had nowhere to go, and she helped them find somewhere. Some of them had property they didn't know about, and she helped them find graft. Some of them just needed 3 days of not being told what to think, and she gave them that too, because she remembered what 3 days of being spoken to as a full person had done for her, and she intended to pay it forward every day she had the ability to do so. Elias was there through all of it. He had his survey work, his maps, his quiet presence in the yard, and at the table, and in the ongoing conversation of 2 people learning together what it meant to build something side by side, without either of them disappearing into the other. He did not manage her. She did not manage him. They built. On the morning of the 1st of December, a cold, clear morning with frost on the meadow grass and the river running dark and fast at the eastern edge of the land, Abigail sat at the writing table in Ruth's Crossing and opened the old record book Martha had given her months ago, the one with her grandmother's name on the page near the middle. She turned to a blank page near the back. She picked up her pen. At the top of the page, she wrote the date. Below it, she wrote the name of the house. Below that, she began a list not of names, yet not formal records. Those came later and were kept in proper ledgers. This was something else. This was the kind of writing you do when you need to mark a moment when the world has no ceremony for what you've lived through and you have to make one yourself. She wrote Ruth Carver built a door in 1793 and trusted someone would come through it. She wrote Eleanor Carver never knew the door existed. She wrote Abigail arrived at the door in the summer of 1814 with $11, 1 canvas bag, and the most important thing she owned, the ability finally to recognize what was hers. She sat back. Outside, she could hear Elias in the yard talking to one of the men from the settlement about a boundary survey. She could hear Dora inside the kitchen moving through the morning tasks with the easy efficiency of someone who had learned that competence was not something to hide, but something to use. She could hear the river. She could hear the land. 42 acres of it, hers. Recorded, documented, legally unchallengeable, bearing her grandmother's name, and now her own. She picked up the pen again and wrote the last line. Some women do not leave loudly. They leave before dawn with 1 bag and 1 broken heart, and 1 truth, that they were never as small as the world required them to be. They leave, and they walk into the dark, and they do not stop walking until they find the door that was always waiting for them, and then they open it, and then they build something that lasts. She closed the book. She stood up. She walked to the door of Ruth's Crossing and opened it, and the cold December air came in clean and sharp and full of the smell of the river and the frost and the land. And Abigail stood in the doorframe of the house her grandmother had made possible, and looked at the 42 acres that were hers, that had always been hers, that no man had ever truly owned, regardless of what any law had once allowed him to believe. She was 28 years old. She was just beginning. And she was exactly, precisely, completely who she had always been before the marriage, before the silence, before the 7 years of making herself convenient. The granddaughter of Ruth Carver, who had looked at an unjust world and decided with great deliberate intelligence to build something inside it that the world couldn't take back. Abigail had done the same, and unlike